America has long been the center of global alliances, NATO, G7, trade partners, you name it. But under Donald Trump, something shifted. Allies weren't just questioned. They were challenged, threatened. Some were even insulted. The result? Quiet meetings, rethinking strategies, and one by one, longtime partners began stepping away. This isn't about war, it's about trust. And trust once broken doesn't come back so easily. From Europe to Asia, Latin America to the Pacific, Trump's foreign policy didn't just make headlines. It changed the world order. Today, we're counting 10 key American allies who are distancing themselves, and what it means for the U.S. going forward. Before Donald Trump took office, U.S. foreign policy was predictable, even if not always popular. Global alliances were maintained through diplomacy, consistency, and mutual benefit. But in 2017, all that changed. Trump entered the White House with a very different playbook. He saw global alliances not as relationships but as transactions. His message to allies was blunt: pay more, do more, or walk away. In his first year alone, he withdrew the U.S. from the Paris Climate Agreement, a move that stunned European nations who had championed the deal. Then came his harsh criticism of NATO, calling it obsolete, and demanding that member countries contribute more financially or risk losing American military support. For many allies, it wasn't the demands themselves, but the delivery. Public shaming, tweets targeting heads of state, negotiations that felt more like ultimatums. Trade allies were also hit hard. Trump imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum from Canada, the EU, and even Japan, arguing it was a matter of national security. The response? Shock. Then retaliation. Long-trusted partners suddenly found themselves labeled economic threats. Even at multilateral summits like the G7, Trump stood apart. He refused to sign joint communiques, he pushed an America First narrative while leaders like Germany's Angela Merkel and Canada's Justin Trudeau tried to preserve the old world order. But perhaps the most symbolic moment came when Trump embraced rivals while alienating allies. Lavish praise for North Korea's Kim Jong-un and cozy moments with Vladimir Putin while long-standing allies were kept at arm's length. This wasn't just politics, it was a signal. And the world listened. As a result, many U.S. allies began quietly reassessing their positions. If America was no longer predictable or loyal, they had to start preparing for a world where the U.S. might not always be at their side. And for some, that shift has already begun. But Europe, once America's most stable group of allies, found itself on uncertain ground during the Trump presidency. From Berlin to Brussels, leaders who had long trusted the transatlantic relationship were suddenly rethinking everything. It started with NATO. Trump repeatedly criticized European members for not meeting their defense spending targets. While the issue wasn't new, Trump's tone was. He called out countries by name, especially Germany, demanding they pay their fair share or risk losing U.S. protection. The threat? America might walk away from the alliance entirely. This rhetoric shook the European Union. Leaders like Angela Merkel warned that Europe could no longer rely on others, a clear sign that the U.S. was no longer seen as the steady anchor it once was. It was a diplomatic earthquake. The Paris Agreement exit was another deep cut. France's Emmanuel Macron had positioned himself as a climate leader, and Trump's withdrawal felt like betrayal. Even traditional allies like the UK expressed regret and concern. Trade made things worse. Trump slapped tariffs on European steel and aluminum, citing national security. Europe hit back with counter-tariffs on American goods, Harley-Davidsons, bourbon, even Levi's jeans. It became a tit-for-tat battle that left scars. In response, Europe didn't just protest, they acted. The EU doubled down on plans for strategic autonomy. Military cooperation projects like PESCO gained momentum. European leaders discussed building an independent defense identity, one less reliant on Washington. And there was a noticeable shift in tone. Instead of calling the U.S. the leader of the free world, Europe started referring to the rules-based international order, a subtle but powerful sign. They were preparing to lead without America. To be clear, the U.S. remains a powerful force in Europe, but trust, real, strategic trust, was shaken. And some wounds, even among friends, don't heal easily. In Asia, America's alliances have long served as a counterweight to rising powers like China and North Korea. But during Trump's presidency, even Washington's closest partners began to reconsider their dependence. Take Japan, one of the United States' strongest post-WWII allies. Under Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, Japan had invested heavily in maintaining close ties with the U.S., but Trump's withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, on day one of his term sent a clear signal. Multilateral cooperation was no longer a priority. For Tokyo, that meant lost influence and fewer tools to balance China's growing dominance in the region. Then came Trump's unprecedented diplomacy with North Korea. While the world watched his historic handshake with Kim Jong-un, allies like Japan and South Korea were deeply uneasy. There was no coordination, no guarantees, and suddenly, decades of regional security strategy seemed upended overnight. In South Korea, Trump's threats to withdraw U.S. troops unless Seoul dramatically increased its financial contributions sparked concern. South Koreans began to question the reliability of the U.S. as a defense partner. In response, Seoul accelerated defense projects of its own and strengthened ties with regional neighbors. At the same time, China was stepping in. As the U.S. pulled back from trade agreements and climate talks, Beijing pushed forward with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, the world's largest trade deal, without U.S. involvement. Countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, and Singapore began expanding economic ties with China, even as they kept military cooperation with the U.S. What emerged in Asia was a new kind of balancing act. Countries still valued their U.S. alliances, but they were no longer betting everything on Washington. Trump's America wasn't just unpredictable, it was transactional, and in a region where trust and long-term strategy mattered deeply, that changed the calculus. Now, as the geopolitical chessboard evolves, Asia isn't walking away from the U.S., but it's quietly building insurance. Latin America has always had a complex relationship with the United States, one shaped by trade, migration, and history. Under Trump, that relationship was tested like never before. Take Mexico, America's neighbor and key trading partner. Trump's push to build a border wall, paired with his repeated claims that Mexico would pay for it, infuriated leaders across the political spectrum. Diplomatic ties grew tense even as trade continued. The renegotiation of NAFTA, rebranded as the USMCA, brought more uncertainty. While the deal eventually passed, the process was chaotic and laced with threats. Mexico and Canada were both slapped with tariffs during negotiations, leaving a bitter aftertaste. For many in Mexico, it felt less like a partnership and more like pressure. In Brazil, Trump initially found a friend in President Jair Bolsonaro, who echoed his tone on everything from climate to China. But even that alignment had limits. As global markets shifted and China's influence in South America grew, Brazil began balancing its interests more carefully. Today, China is Brazil's biggest trading partner. By far, across the region, Trump's America First approach sparked questions. If the U.S. could turn on its closest neighbors, how dependable was it as a long-term ally? Countries like Argentina, Chile, and Colombia began strengthening regional ties and looking to Europe and Asia for economic opportunity. China invested billions in infrastructure through its Belt and Road Initiative, building ports, highways, and tech deals, from Ecuador to Panama. The message was clear: if the U.S. was stepping back or turning inward, Latin America would not wait. Instead, it would move forward, with or without Washington. Not all diplomatic rifts were expected. Two of America's closest allies, Canada and Australia, also experienced moments of quiet distancing during Trump's term. Let's start with Canada. The relationship between Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and President Trump was famously rocky. During the NAFTA renegotiations, Trump imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, citing national security. Canadians were outraged. How could their closest ally, literally sharing the longest undefended border in the world, label them a threat? The tension peaked during the 2018 G7 summit, when Trump publicly insulted Trudeau and withdrew his support from a joint communiqué after leaving the meeting early. For Canada, it wasn't just about economics, it was about respect. Trust was shaken. Ottawa began speaking more openly about diversifying its trade partnerships, including deals with the EU and Pacific nations. And then there's Australia, a loyal military and intelligence partner under the Five Eyes alliance. Yet even this relationship hit turbulence. Trump's abrupt decision to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, hurt Australia's trade ambitions. And an early phone call between Trump and then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull reportedly ended in a heated exchange over refugee resettlement. Though cooperation continued, Australia began leaning more heavily on regional partnerships like AUKUS with the UK and US and trade deals with Asian nations. Its foreign policy began to focus more on strategic independence, especially as China loomed larger in the Pacific. Both Canada and Australia didn't break ties, but the tone changed. The blind loyalty of the past gave way to careful calculation. Even America's safest friendships aren't immune to strain, especially when allies start to feel like afterthoughts. The Trump presidency didn't destroy America's alliances, but it revealed just how fragile they really were. For decades, the U.S. stood as a pillar of global leadership, a country trusted to act with consistency, diplomacy, and strength. But during Trump's years in office, many allies saw a different face, one that was transactional, confrontational, and at times dismissive. What emerged was a powerful global message: we need to prepare for a world where America might not show up. This wasn't about a single tweet or a headline-grabbing speech, it was a pattern. Withdrawals from agreements, surprise tariffs, public insults, and cozying up to adversaries. Allies watched closely. Some stayed silent, others began planning alternatives. Europe launched defense cooperation without the US. Asia signed the largest trade agreement in history with America absent. Latin America welcomed Chinese investment, and even historic partners like Canada and Australia took steps to diversify their strategies. America's global image didn't collapse overnight, but the shift was undeniable. And here's the catch: winning back trust is much harder than losing it. Today, U.S. alliances remain, but they're more cautious, more conditional. The world now knows that Washington can pivot fast, and with elections looming every few years, who's to say it won't pivot again? In the end, Trump's policies didn't just redraw maps or change trade deals, they changed minds. And for a global order built on mutual confidence, that may be the most lasting legacy of all.